Hello and welcome to a tutorial on Geo Control 2. Not the typical view tutorial, but that's alright. This is still an amazing program, and it's really fun to use, and it goes and works really well with View itself as well. So to get started, this is just going to be a simple tutorial on just some of the few basic, and when I say basic, just some of the most basic functions that you'll do inside Geo Control. And I'll briefly go over what those settings are and what those different options you can choose from will do. One of the first things we'll do is we'll go to up here on the tool bar up here, and these are very simple. There's not really a lot to Geo Control when it comes to being the options that you can choose in the toolbar. You have project, which you can close, and if you click on it, it closes the entire project. Generation, which will load terrain settings, save, import, export. You can do color maps here. You can do new, so on and so forth. These are all very self-explanatory things. If you know even a little bit about 3D terrain modeling, or even just any kind of import or export when it comes to working in 3D programs or even 2D programs, then you'll know what these do. View is just when you look at the view options here, that just gives you different shaders you can choose from, presets, so like your color maps that you get right here. And we'll go over a few of these a little later. Right here, the preferences, the font size, you can change the font size for the texts here. It requires you to restart Geo Control, and then there's help. Help has a lot of good stuff like getting started. It even takes you right to the forum, which is amazing. It is in German, or not all of it, I guess. Some of it is. This program was made by an awesome person named Johannes, and he's still working on it. He hasn't come out with a lot of stuff lately, but he's still working on it. He's active in the forums. I don't know how active the forums are now. I haven't been on them in a couple months, but when I was on them, they were pretty active, and so on and so forth. So there's not much to go on in the toolbar. The next thing you see under the toolbar is this little bar right here that's empty. It's kind of gray. This is your status bar. So when you start making different changes in the terrain, a little green bar will pop up here, and this is what will show you the status of what's being worked on. If you look down here, it gives you the size of the terrain map you're working on. The zoom doesn't do anything, and the view down here doesn't really do anything. And then they just give you coordinates here, so when you move around the map here, you can see the height of the tallest point, like over here in the white, light gray areas, and so on and so forth as you move around. So not much there. Next thing is this. You click on this, it brings up the user interface, and then this right here, or the guide on it anyways, you can get that by going to help and then clicking on help. It'll bring this up, and then you can find it, anything you need regarding the interface in here and how things work. So there's the user interface, or you can just click on that button right there and it'll bring up just the interface part. And it'll tell you what's what. So we can go over this. I could, but I won't. I'll let you go over this, just because there's some good stuff in here and it explains things really well. However, a lot of this is pretty self-explanatory. So let's go ahead and close that. This button right here, 3D, changes it between a 2D and 3D view. So if it currently says 3D, that means you can change to a 3D view. If it says 2D, then it'll go back to a, if it says 2D, then when you click on it, it'll go to a 2D view. So right now we can go to 3D. And this is what we currently have in our 3D view. Now that it says 2D, we can go back to 2D. That's what we get. The preset browser right here, the developer put in a bunch of presets that comes with the program. So there's some that some artists made, some presets from other people. You can load any of these up and play around with them. They actually give you the size of the terrain and how long it took them to make it and render it out, and that's estimated anyways. So you can go ahead and load those up, and you can see all the different variations you can make inside of Geo Control with different settings and so on and so forth. And they even have some from Geo Control 1, or the first Geo Control, and these don't have previews for some reason. And then they have some for Geo Control 2. These look really good. I like these. And then they were there's my presets, which you can make a new one, you can add them, delete them, what so on and so forth. Then they just have some testing ones that you can play with to test with. This is another generation button. So if you make a change here, you can push generate and it'll generate the change, or you can just push generate right here and it'll make the change, whichever one you choose. So that's pretty much that. Pretty easy. There's not too much confusion going on there. Over here, however, is where things start getting a little different. So here's the project tab. There's nothing listed under here. You can't really change anything over here to add something, so I think he has more ideas to put in here, but for now there's nothing really in there, and when you push generate, it just takes you to the generation tab, and this is where you pretty much do everything. So it'll probably default to the general tab, but I'm going to start with the multi-tab, and in the multi-tab there's these different options here that you can change. There's like the camera, the light, texture, selector, and stuff like that. We'll get into this a little later. There's not so much in here that we're going to play with to help get us started on basic usage of Geo Control. I'm going to go to the General tab, and here's where you do a lot of your customization. So the dimensions here changes the terrain size and detail. So 1024 is a good starting point. You can go lower if you want. I always keep it at 1024. It's a good starting point. This is the width of the terrain, so you can change that to meters or kilometers. I like it in kilometers. And then there's height, which you can change to meters or centimeters. And I keep it at meters just because it is easy and nice to work with. So we don't want it to be too high. We want it to be more long than high. So we're just gonna turn this down to about 3,000? I'm gonna put 3,500. There we go. So that's the height of our terrain. That's the highest point of our terrain, and this is the longest point of our terrain, width-wise. General terrain settings here. There's random noise. So at 8 is a good default level. The more you go up here and then generate, the more noise your terrain gets. And if I go up another step, you can see more noise, and so on and so forth. So in my opinion, if you're trying to make single mountain ranges, you can stick between anywhere from 8 to 16. 16 might be a good default level, and this is just randomly generated. As soon as we start doing our own easel lines, things will change a little bit. And then if anything right here, if you hit generate, if keep seeds not checked, every time you hit generate, it's going to generate different noises here, as you can see. So if you check keep seed and then you generate, it doesn't change. You can type in whatever seed you want just randomly. You can make it seamless, hit generate, and now there won't be any seams. So when you go to 3D, you can see the difference between seamless and not seamless. Kind of just changes the terrain a little bit. I like keeping seamless checked. And then there's protect terrain up to level, and then it says 1. So if we go to 8, let's go ahead and generate. You can see nothing's really changed. If we go to 256, nothing's really changed, but that's because you need a terrain level up to 1024. So we hit 1024. This is not possible. Try this. Use the next tab, post work. Reduce the tab general. Protect terrain up to level. So it gives you little hints of what you can do. I always just keep that at 1. I don't ever really play with that. Now, when we're inside the General tab, there's the easel lines. Now, I'm going to go ahead and go to 3D, and I'm going to go ahead and check on easel lines, and it asks you if you want to start on an empty terrain. I always hit yes. And now we have just a big blue square. However, this is where you start creating your terrain inside of Geo Control to how you want it. So, you always start out with easel layer 0. Just to go over a few options here. Easel layer 0 is going to be your default layer. These are your options to create your easel lines. There's an auto generator box right here, and I'll show you what that does. And then these are your levels and their strengths. This I'll go into in depth on a different tutorial, but I'll just show you slightly how this works in this tutorial. This is right here is your height slider. So we obviously want something higher than what we had. So if 3,500 is the highest height that we made in our General tab right here, then this is going to be the highest point we can go in our terrain. So white being the highest, blue being the lowest. Dark blue, sorry. So I'm going to find just an in-between, so maybe 2,749, and then to create your easel line and start generating your terrain, you need to make sure you have your pen right here clicked on and selected. It'll be green when it's selected. And then you just come over here inside of your blue box and you just click anywhere you want and you drag, and it'll create a line, and that line is your easel line. Now when you hit generate, it'll generate your terrain, and you can go into the 3D view and you can see what you drew. So this is actually a really good example for telling you how the levels and their strengths work. So level 4 being the lowest possible detail you can get at the lowest altitude, and this is how I explain it. Might not be how the developer will explain it, but if I were to take level 4 all the way down, a lot of this chunk down here on the terrain will disappear. I'll show you. So all the way down, and as you can see, a lot of that is not being rendered because there's just no power in it, there's no strength. That's level 4. The next level, level 8, is going to be this mid-range detail right here, or even lower right here. So if I take this down and generate, you can see how now it's the terrain we had before is now looking more like the line we drew. Obviously that's not realistic and we don't want that, but that's kind of how it works. So I'm going to go ahead and bring in a little bit more lower detail. I'm just going to kind of invert it to what it was before, and that gives you these we have all this small detail out here further that I might not necessarily want, but for now I'm just going to keep it like that. And if you see this really pronounced, really unnatural line that we got from making our easel line, we can get rid of that, and while maintaining those higher details, and that's by going to these higher levels. So we have level 256, and there's just a little bit of power there. I'm going to take that all the way off and generate. And you can see it was hard to see and notice because there was just a small amount that was there. But there was these little tiny details that went away. But the next level, the 128 level, if I take that all the way down and generate it, now you can see how that line went away. It's less pronounced. And then obviously if I do it for the next one, the 64, now it is, you know, you can still see the nature of the line, and that's because we don't have these settings set up to kind of hide the nature of it. But it's not as pronounced, and it looks a little more natural. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up the lower level again. I'm just going to bring them down like this. No specific fashion, just that's just how I'm going to do it. So before, when we had that really pronounced line, looked more like cliffs rather than a mountain range, or a full mountain range anyways. That's because we had it inverted. So now that it's not inverted, we have more details coming in at those lower areas, and less detail at the higher areas, as you can see. So now if I totally invert these, so if I bring this down to be lower levels, and I just kind of make a Wi-Fi signal there and generate it, now you can see how those upper details are more pronounced and those lower details aren't nearly as much. So I'm going to go ahead and take this up, and this, and this, and this, and generate it one more time. And now we have a more fine line of detail here. So if I wanted this to look more less cliff-like, with less of an edge, I just bring this down to about there, and there we go. Now there's more natural flow in the terrain. So I'm gonna re-invert these back to their original state. So I'm just gonna try to attempt to have little amounts of detail here. And now you can see that there's not that big of a gradient from lower detail to upper detail. That's because the strengths are so low. They're not really pronounced. So if I were to bring this up and generate it, now you can see all that detail within those levels. And if I were to bring this up, kind of keep these similar, and generate it, now you can see how it's working. So that's just a really quick way of explaining to you how things are working inside of Geo Control with the levels and the strengths. And like I said, this is just basic, just really quick tutorial. And that's also on one easel layer. There's tons of other things we can do with other layers and adjusting those levels. But for now, this is just what I'm going to show you. I'm going to bring this down because I don't want it to be as pronounced. And I'm going to bring this down a little bit. And I'm going to bring this up. And I'm going to generate. There we go. I'm going to bring this down even more. I can still see the line right there. And there we go. And I'm going to take the pen tool again. Well, I'm going to add one more layer. Nope, never mind. I'm going to keep it on the same layer, but I am going to lower the altitude to be lower. I'm going to take it all the way down to 0, and then just from out here, I'm just going to draw a line going through the middle and generate that. And what you can see after I do that, it kind of took the difference. So now I have this kind of valley going on. Of course, there's still this mountain path right here that wasn't reduced, and in order to reduce it more, you just continue drawing the lines a few times. And you can also adjust the power levels here. Having this higher detail up all the way will help. And there we go. So now we have these hard cliffs on the edge and this valley, which you can put like a river in or something coming out, and then maybe two giant statues right here taking form, you know, like they did in Lord of the Rings, you know? Yeah, that's what they did. Something similar anyways. And we can adjust this still to make it look more realistic, because right now it just looks like plain old height maps. So I'm going to take this down just a schmid, generate it one more time and see what we get. There we go. Now we don't have those huge rocks on the side. I kind of like them. They're kind of cool. Maybe I'll raise this up so they become a little more pronounced, and this little bit right here goes away. So there we go. And to get rid of this, we just take our line tool and we just draw a few times here and generate. There we go. River, mountains. Okay, so filter. We're done here. I'll explain more detail on what you can do with more layers and more levels and maybe the height, the second height that you can enable. But for now, we're done here. I'm going to go ahead and go to filter. In filter you have basic noise and selective noise. I don't want you to touch any of those. We can play around with those at a later time. But for now I just want you to go ahead and click on add. And right here it gives you a few options. It gives you a filter browser, general forming, shape filters, erosion system inverse, and then displacement filters. We can go through the majority of these at another time when I just covered just the filters. But I want you to go ahead and just click on mountains ridged, and just to see what the default values will look like on this, let's go ahead and hit generate, and that's what we get. That's the filter that we get. I don't really like the default values, so you can go to filter presets and choose any of these presets that you want. You can even change your filter by clicking on another one, so we can even go to mountains full ridged and just clicking on like maybe the classic Alpine 2 snow covered with deep snow, and then hit. When you double click on it, it'll ask, this filter preset is based on lower noise power, auto adjust noise power. Just click yes. Go ahead and close it and hit generate. And this is what we get after that. And I don't really like the default values for these, and I kind of want to stick with just the regular mountains ridged instead of full ridged. And instead of deleting it or removing it and then adding again, you can just click on change and then go and change it to mountains ridged. And then let's go ahead and go to settings. And these are very basic settings that I can go through really easily. So obviously the general strength is how much strength the overall effects of these two options have. So we can click generate. These are the basic settings. Let's go ahead and go to slope smoothing and reduce that to about 20. Hit generate. And there we go. And then let's go ahead and go to general strength and increase that to about 70. We'll see what that does and how that works. Okay. I don't like these flat tops that we're getting right here. And that's just because of our easel lines. We don't have any detail up there. That's because they're all flat to begin with. I'm going to go ahead and click raised ridge reducing, and a little bit goes a far ways on this. You don't have to add too much. And then I'm going to increase the slope smoothing again, so that just kind of smooths the slopes and might even help with the flat parts up here. And I'm going to go ahead and hit generate. There we go. So now we have these more mountainous looks, but again, I'm not really digging the entire look and feel of this. I'm going to click on change, shape filters, mountains full ridged. Let's go ahead and generate that. And that will keep the same settings that we had for our other filter. The overall, the algorithm used for mountains full ridged changed from the mountains ridged. So that's why we get different shapes and different formations. However, as you can see, we still have a lot of little noise here and there. So I'm going to go ahead and lower this back down to 50 and generate. Alright, so looks like we have to find an in-between to get a good look. So I know this is kind of a more in-depth on the filter than anything else, but this is where we can get really good shapes and formations inside of Geo Control. So I'm liking that. Obviously these flat areas I don't really like too much, so we can work on that later. But I think if we import this in the view, we'll probably be doing a lot of rendering from lower altitudes, like down here in the valley, so we get a lot of good we can see a lot of good detail going up the mountain range rather than from the top down, especially if you throw in some water in there. And then that looks good. I actually don't mind that. I'm going to go ahead and increase the ridge reducing one more time and lower this down to 25 and generate it. There we go. And so we don't have nearly as hard ridges and so on and so forth. I'm going to add one more filter, so we just click on add and go to erosion system. And it's very much recommended when you choose an erosion system that you choose it and I'll show you. I'm going to go ahead and choose hard fluvial, and then from here immediately take down the strength to at least 40, 35 to 40, and then reduce flow amount to at least 2. And the only reason why I say this is because sometimes it can take forever to render out erosion in Geo Control, because when you look at your task manager, when you're running only Geo Control, it's only using one core out of your processor. So if you have a single core processor, you might actually be able to get better performance out of it than like a 4-core processor, because it's not taking advantage of those other additional cores. That may have changed recently. As far as I know, I have Geo Control 2 revision 60 or something like that, and it's still only using one core. So I just do that so it doesn't take as long to render out. And obviously having your if you go to General tab and then the General tab under General and lower this to a lower value, your terrain size, that'll also increase or decrease the amount of time it takes. But I feel with the settings we have now, it'll be just fine. So if I hit generate, you can see it do its thing up here, and if you look down here, it'll tell you what level it's generating. And now we can see how it looks now with erosion. So it's kind of hard to tell because we don't have we're not coloring just the erosional system. But if we increase the power again, and then decrease the flow, or reduce flow amount, and then generate one more time. So this is kind of more like what we had for default settings, minus we are reducing the flow amount a little bit. You can see how much longer it's taking just by increasing the general strength. So you got to be careful. Alright, now we can see a little more of that erosional system kicking in. Which is great actually, because Geo Control has an awesome erosion system. So I'm going to go ahead and this is just the randomness of the erosion flows, the randomness option right here. So I'm going to go ahead and increase that to about 22. I'm going to keep if you increase the sharpness, you'll be able to see the fluvial lines a little bit better. If you have it too high, it looks fake. You gotta be really careful with that. It also increases the time for the render. And then the width is how wide those fluvial lines are. And then decrease the angle, obviously, depending on the angle, from 0 to 90 degrees. About 30 degrees they will be decreased. And then the reduced flow amount reduces the amount of flow there is. Then there's a starting point which is really hard to explain. You just have to play around with it. I feel if you have it set to 1, it affects most of the terrain. If you have it set to a higher value, like 7, then it only affects certain parts of the terrain, like higher parts up here, and then they flow more down towards the ground or the lower levels. So I changed it from 6 to 7 and it kind of changed it drastically, but if I change it from 7 to like 2, let's see what that does. Looks like it's going to increase the render time drastically because it's probably affecting more of the terrain. And you can see how it affected most of the terrain. It actually increased the render times too, so that is definitely not what I want. I don't like the way that looks either. So I'm going to change the starting point from 2 to, I liked it how it looked at 7. It didn't affect the entire terrain, and it also looked a little more natural. So I'm going to go ahead and generate that out. And you can see it's much faster. That finished in a couple seconds, whereas the other one took like 2 to 3 minutes. So you can kind of see the difference there. Alright, so I have everything here that I want inside of the filter. There's a lot of other filter options to go and talk about, but I'm just going to cover just the ones I have here already. Next is post, and in post there's a lot of awesome things you can do inside of here actually. One of the most amazing ones I think is the river and lakes. So here you can actually specify different points which are considered springs inside of Geo Control, and Geo Control actually render out scientifically and procedurally river systems and lakes to cover your terrain, and it flows in a natural way where it is harder to get through landscape if there's uphill patterns in the terrain. Also depending on how hard the rock is, so like the soft areas down here where there's sediment flows, those are a lot easier for water to go through than the actual rocky areas. I'm not going to get into that in this tutorial, but that's how that's an amazing feature, I think, and then you can get some really interesting looks and awesome natural looks for that matter. So I'm gonna go ahead and skip past everything in the post because you need to add a filter here and change settings, and it can take a while, so I'll just save it for a later time. Next is the selector tab. Here you can select different filters and noises that you have available for selection. You can change different things, like you can change the hard fluvial erosion system that we have here, which is available for the selection here. You can change how high you want it to affect, at what point in the terrain you want it to start affecting the most, and then the fuzzy here is kind of like your feathering system, where there's a nice soft gradient. Instead of it being all hard down, it goes down, so it's like your fuzzy or your noise that you can add. You can select the height minimum and the height maximum, where 0 being is the very bottom, 3500, which is what we specified at the beginning, being the highest. So if I wanted the erosion system to only affect mid-range, I would select something like this. Obviously you have to enable the height as well. And when you enable height, this little green button right here, or not button but square, appears right here, letting you know that you have your height selected in here. So if you go to these other tabs, you can see that you still have that selected. So if I enable that, it goes green, so on and so forth. So that's a really nice feature to have. I really like that, because then you don't have to go back to your different tabs and make sure you have them selected. That green already shows you that. So that's what I would do if I only wanted to have erosion affecting only the mid-range parts of my terrain. So this is about where I would put it, is somewhere in this area, but I don't, so I'm just going to leave them at default. Orientation obviously is dependent on degrees and angles. So this is your angle, goes up to 360 degrees. Orientation is your, I want to say, rotation of the hard fluvial erosion. I'm just not going to choose anything here. Then you have your fuzzy, which you can change to have a nice smooth gradient. Then there's slope. So if you want a certain filter, so we can add selection 1 here, we can go here, and then if we, or your filter, and then we go to mountains full ridged, we can have your selection here, which will be inactive selection 1. Now that that's been selected, we can go here and we can rename it. So we can rename it to our mountains full ridged, and then we can have it affect, height, orientation, slope, so on and so forth. So you don't have to have your filter affecting your entire landscape. You can only have it affecting certain parts of your landscape using that. However, I don't want to do that, so I'm going to remove that selection, and I'm just going to go ahead and skip past the selector part. And like I said, in other tutorials I'll get into these different options more in depth, but for now we're just going to keep it basic. I think the filter part right here was going to be the most in-depth part of this tutorial. And then here's render. This rendering option right here, you can do an in-program render at not final detail, but, well, I guess it would be considered final detail because you have your quality parts right here where there's a quarter quality, half quality, and full quality. But given Geo Control is awesome at making terrains really quickly that look really natural and realistic, I probably wouldn't do my final renders inside of Geo Control. A, it's not very intuitive with the options here, and B, you can get better detail and more customization after you've created and generated your terrain inside of View than you can in Geo Control when it comes to like texturing and adding modifications. And lighting, for instance, is a lot easier inside of View than it is inside of Geo Control. But here's your camera options. Height and zoom are pretty self-explanatory, where height is if you have it all the way up, the camera moves up in altitude, and then if you have it lower, then it moves lower in altitude. And then zoom is obviously self-explanatory too, where if you have it all the way here, and you zoom in, it zooms in at your terrain, and if you have it zoom out, it zooms out of your terrain. Distance is kind of like how close or far away the camera is to the terrain. So if I have it all the way up here, it gets really close, or really far away, sorry, it's backwards. And if I have this back here, it gets really close, and I'm so close that you can't even see anything. So I'm going to go out. There we go. And then this is how you can tell how detailed your terrain's going to be. Obviously, if we render it at a higher terrain size, it's going to look better. But this is why I say we should import it into View. So, and then point at kind of shows like is the where the camera is going to be pointed. So if I have it over here, it points more towards the right, I believe. And if I have it over here, it points more towards the left, or up and down maybe, depending on where the slider lands. This is why it's kind of different to use the camera controls in here, because they're not very intuitive. I think he said that he was planning on recreating these options in here to make them a little bit easier to use. They're not hard, they're just a little bit different. So, and then there's left and right shifts, so this kind of just moves the camera physically left or right. If I move the slider to the right, the camera moves to the right. And then right here you can actually test out your point out option, and looks like it's pointing more down, and if I move this up, it's pointing more up. And then right here, I guess this changes the camera's position. So right now we're at the bottom of the terrain. So let me just zoom out a little bit. Change my distance. Render. There we go. So this is the bottom of the terrain, this edge, and this edge is the right side. So if I go over here and render it out, we are now at the right edge. If I go over to the top, we are now at the top edge of the terrain. And if I go to the left, we are now at the left edge of the terrain. And all these in between, like right here and right here and right here, are just in between areas and it looks like we're going to probably get the best view of our terrain from the top mid-ranges and the bottom and their mid-ranges. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to the bottom mid-range so we can get just a slightly different view. And that's just talking about the edges. So the camera's not moving up or down or left or right. It's just changing the position from this edge to that edge to that edge, so on and so forth. So I'm going to go back to the bottom all the way so we can go back to our default view. I'm going to change the height a little bit. Distance I'm going to change again, and I'm going to change the point at to mid-range, and I'm going to shift it more back towards the right, and this is what we have. Then you have your light source, which the sun position, obviously if you slide this around, these are probably degrees because it goes from 0 to almost 360. But you can play around with it. It doesn't take very long for it to render out. You can see the shadows changing. Then there's the height, so this is the position where the sun's at in the sky. The lower you go, the more sunsetty it gets, so on and so forth. Sun power is how bright the sun's going to be. The higher the slider, the more power there is, the brighter it's going to be. And then there's the ambient lighting, so if we have this down, shadows are going to be darker. And if we have it more up, they're going to be more bright or more lit up, more light being bounced into the shadows. Then there's the ambient contrast, so this is just going to be, you'll see when we render it out, all these little shadows on the rocks here and there are going to be a little bit darker because there's not as much light bouncing into them. You don't want them too dark. And then there's ambient blue, which kind of fakes global illumination. So if I increase this, the terrain's going to get a little bit more blue and white-ish. You can kind of see how that works. Too much makes it look not realistic, but just a little bit makes it look pretty good. And then there's fog, and if we increase this, it just kind of increases, fog distance. A lot of fog obviously doesn't look too great, but little fog probably wouldn't look very good either. So a good little mid-range, or not mid-range, but within the first quarter of the slider looks pretty good. Obviously this isn't the best way to be rendering out your terrain with great detail because the lighting options are very thin, and you can't really get the exact options you want, though they are pretty easy and self-explanatory. That gives you a good idea of what your terrain's going to look like depending on where the sun's at inside of View or whatever program you're using. So it gives you a really good idea of how it's going to look, but maybe not final look. Then there's texture, and there's no real good way of texturing this. They're just colors. You can't get like rock or procedural coloring or anything like that. You kind of have to work around it to get something different. I'm not going to play with this too much. And then that's that. This is our simple little terrain that we made. If you want to see different colorations other than this boring color, and go to View, Coloring. You can click on Use Shader, or Coloring, and then choose any of these. So let's click on Canadian Tundra. There's that. You go to 3D View. You can't really change anything because these are just color maps, but you can kind of see what different coloring is going to be. You can, in the texture, this is where you're going to get your 3D coloring, is right here inside the texture tab under Render. So if you want to texture your terrain inside of Geo Control and then export those textures into View or Terragen or whatever for like the flow maps of your erosion or the rocks of the these areas on the mountain ridged filter, you can definitely do that. But I'm ready for a good final render of this and then exporting it. So I'm under General, in the Generation tab, under General, and then General again. Click on your terrain size. You can choose any of these two options. or they're 2048. I'm just going to choose for the sake of expediency, and then generate. And then in later versions, he's going to increase the terrain size. It's in the works. He has it down as something that's being worked on the forums. So you'll be able to get like 8196 or 8148 or whatever that next level of detail is, which is going to be awesome. And he also said that multi-core support is coming as well. So you'll be able to render out these higher levels of detail a lot faster. So now that we have our terrain size where we want it and we have it rendered out, you can see how fast it was. Didn't take very long. You can see down here that the rendering is done. You can see that the size has changed to 2048, so on and so forth. Let's go ahead and click on generation, and then go to terrain export, and then choose whichever one you want to use. For me, I'm going to use the TIFF 16-bit grayscale. It's for displacement and views procedural terrain editor. Go ahead and click on wherever you want to save it. I'm just going to save it as tutorial terrain, and click on save, and Geo Control will export it. When it's done, you can either save, I don't think you'll be able to save your, yeah, you can save your terrain settings, or you can export multi-terrain, or not export, but you can save the terrain settings and then load the terrain settings later. When you click on here, you can choose where. Like if I save it on my desktop, you just load them and then it'll load your file again. I'm just going to go ahead and close it and put that down. And I'm already rendering some testing landscapes that I made in Geo Control here for a buddy for a video that we're working on. However, these are for sci-fi. This is a sci-fi look that I'm trying to go for, so these are not realistic at all. I intentionally made them look like that for style, I guess. But we're going to go ahead and I'll go ahead and open up a new window in View. So if you're using View, you can follow along. You can, if you're using any other program, I hope you have enough knowledge in that program in order to import your terrain file, your height map. But inside of View, if you saved it as a TIFF 16-bit file, go ahead and click on your procedural terrain button. Go ahead and double click on procedural terrain, and that'll load up your terrain editor. Alright, and let's go ahead and edit the function, delete all of this. If you click on the altitude node down here and then click on the texture map node right here, it'll automatically link it. That's a nice easy way of doing it. I'm going to change the interpolation type to bicubic. If you don't do this, you'll get these weird lines in the terrain that kind of look like it's a terrace effect, but it's horrible and it does not look good. So if you change the interpolation type to bicubic, that won't affect your terrain, and if it does, it's very minor and you won't notice it in your final render. Go ahead and click on the load image button, the yellow button to choose a file, and then I'm going to choose the terrain tutorial terrain. Click open, click OK, and then View will render it over here. You want 0 edges unchecked, unless you want them checked, but in my opinion, uncheck it. And then you're going to want to raise the detail level. Even though this is a procedural terrain, it's not done on a fractal level, it's done with a height map, so you will have to raise your detail here in order to get those fine details that you saw in Geo Control. I'm not going to do it because my computer is already rendering on an image in View and it's taking quite a toll on my processor, so I'm just going to keep it at 256. Click OK. Okay, let's load it out, and we try to find it in our viewfinder. Also, you want to scale the terrain to what you had inside of Geo Control. So obviously, if you have this locked, you won't have the same settings that you had before. I believe the width was 22 kilometers and the height was 3,500 meters. But that's not going to look good because it's going to be stretched, so you want it to be 22 kilometers that in one direction or in both directions. There we go. And the height, or let's see, 22 kilometers, 22 kilometers, and I don't think we had our highest setting at 3,500, but we can change that to 3,500 meters. And now the terrain will be up to scale as what we had in Geo Control. So you can see this is a massive terrain. And there's so much going on here. But if you don't have it to scale, it's not going to look right. So if it's too big for you, you could always just make it smaller. No one's going to kill you if you do that. But I want it to scale, and then what I want to do is just kind of find a good spot for my camera. I kind of like this mountain part jetting out. I like the shadows that I'm getting off of it too. So I'm just gonna kind of focus on that right there, and there we go. I'm just gonna slap on a quick material right there, and actually I'm going to add another one. Set this to 0. Go to the environment tab here because I'm going to lower this down to about 40. No, maybe a little higher. 60. Yeah, 60 looks good. I'm going to change these just a little bit. Not too much. There's that. Maybe lower this down 55 and hit OK. Take the camera down. It's just setting up the camera at this point. That's all there is to it. Zoom in, and at the detail level that we're rendering out at, it's not going to look too great, but we can get an idea. So let's go ahead and go to Final, Render. We're just going to render at this tiny amount, a small resolution. It also won't take very long to render out because it's at a the terrain size is at a much lower resolution as well, so it won't take as long to render that way. So I stopped the render and put it at preview settings because it was taking a long time with this other render going. But you can see how well it renders out. It took about a minute to render out in preview quality with this other render going, so it didn't take too long as well. But to keep in mind that this terrain isn't at the highest detail quality it can get that we rendered it at, which is 2048. But it was a lot easier to slap on a material, adjust the lighting and everything inside of View than it was in Geo Control, and the terrain looks awesome. And this is just the one side of it. I can show you all of the terrain. I can get close to show you a little bit more detail, but I'll do that in a later tutorial. But this is just how you would basic understanding of Geo Control and importing into View. So if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please let me know, and I will get back to you.